This is our last panel of the conference. Apart from after lunch, we'll have some summary remarks, and we'll have some commentary about that before we break for lunch. But we wanted to invite, as part of this last day, our Art Amble curators. Not all of them could be here, unfortunately. Cole Thrush can't be here, nor Adrian Wong, who's winging it back to Ottawa as we speak. But I do have Adrian and Cole, at least is sort of in terms of the images on here, represented a little bit. So I'm going to actually just play, without the sound, some video from the second and third Ambles, one led by Adrian and the one led by the Other Sites Collective, as well as we have 4 images that Karen took on the walk with Cole and Dylan. And that can just be the background, which you can look up at and glance at. There's only 10 minutes of excerpt because that's all I could do this morning before coming down here on my desktop. But anyway, just to begin, I thought I'd invite our Amble curators to just speak about the curation process. What inspired you, beyond us telling you we wanted these things as part of this event? What prompted you, for instance, in both of your cases, to choose the specific site of the Athletes' Village? And maybe because these 2 Ambles, interestingly for me and very productively, although I wasn't able to attend the first one, were sited in the same vicinity of the city, but had different layers of public art as well as history, and different just sedimented layers of eventness, I would say, that they were engaging with. So, Dylan, do you want to begin just maybe a bit of the process of putting it together?
Sure. Can you hear me if I talk without the mic, or should I talk with the mic?
We just need it for the video.
For the video. Okay. I guess one of the basic criteria for choosing the site was the different layers of indigenous. Sorry, I should also say that the walk that Cole and I curated, curation feels like a bit of a strange word, chose to do was based on indigenous public art. So, and indigenous development, I guess you could say. We also talked about the habitat island, and Cole talked about first nature and second nature and third nature. So this area has quite a wide range of indigenous works, not just in relationship to the Olympics, although there are a few works, 3 works in particular, that were commissioned as part of that. But also before that, works that are in relationship with the development that happened around the time of Expo 86, and Susan Point's storm drain covers that have sort of been placed around the site for quite a while now. So there's a concentration, just very basically, logistically, there's a concentration of indigenous public works in this area, and so logistically we thought this would be a good place to actually show people a wide variety of things in a short amount of time. I should also say that my interest obviously is in indigenous public art, but specifically right now these issues of what happens in relationship with declarations that are made by the city. So in relationship to the Olympics, declarations that the Olympics were in consultation with 4 host First Nations, but even in a more contemporary sense, the declarations made by the city that we are now they have officially announced that we are on unceded Coast Salish territory, and what that means. After a declaration for being holding a year of reconciliation, they have now announced that we are going to be the first city of reconciliation. And so what does that mean? And there are a variety of public art initiatives that have taken place alongside this as well. So some of the work that we didn't see but that's been happening across the city during this year of reconciliation were works, mostly bus transit shelter posters, and also some video billboards that deal with the issue of reconciliation from a variety of different perspectives, indigenous and non-indigenous artists. So there has been a public art initiative that's taken place over the past year. And I think some quite interesting work has taken place. There's a piece up right now by Dion Paul that you might have seen on some of the bus transit shelter posters that she actually uses her children and as sort of the models in this asking them to sit in residential school chairs that say learn. I forget some of the other messages that are from it, but it's really interesting work. So there has been some work that's come out of this initiative that I think is really positive. But of course, the question is, what happens? What kind of work can happen and has happened in a city of reconciliation? What kind of work has happened and can happen in a city that brands itself as being on unceded Coast Salish territory? And these are things that artists are not sort of sitting back and saying, "Oh, I wonder what we're going to be asked to do," but actually, stepping into public spaces and saying, "Well, City of Vancouver, you've said that this is unceded Coast Salish territory, so we're now going to evict you from, for instance, evicting people in Tent City in Oppenheimer Park." There were a couple of people that I mentioned before, I think on the walk, who actually said to the city once they found out that some Aboriginal homeless people were being evicted from Oppenheimer Park, said, "Okay, well, since this is unceded territory, we're now going to say, this is our place, and we're going to ask the city officials who are evicting to leave this place." So I think these are things that are being taken up in really interesting ways by artists and activists in Vancouver. I also wanted to say briefly that I'm quite interested in Vancouver as a city that really promotes public art and has a lot of Indigenous design integrated into the city. I think it's quite prominent in relationship to other Canadian cities, and I always feel like, and I said this on the walk as well, that in other cities sometimes we're pushing to have Indigenous works included in the sort of fabric of the city, and in Vancouver sometimes I feel like we should or we have been pushing against being included or being included in particular ways. To say, well, let's reconsider the terms of inclusion and ask for a different model, a different relationship. I think it was really interesting the way that Kim was talking about collaboration, thinking about models where instead of saying, we want a series of works on reconciliation, to then instead offer opportunities to say, well, we have a variety of really exciting Indigenous artists here in Vancouver. What spaces are of interest to you to use, to claim, to be in relationship with, and where might that go? So I think I would like to see a more open relationship, an offering that took seriously what also sovereignty means in public space, and that's a big question as well, right? How do we think about Indigenous sovereignty in public spaces that are often more private than they are public? So those are just a few thoughts that I have about my interests about public art, Aboriginal public art here in Vancouver, and a little bit about the walk itself. Maybe with that, I'll pass it on to my fellow panelists.
Thanks. That was great. We actually rehearsed our talk. We want extra points for that. And when we sat down to have a conversation about how to structure the talk, I think what's really compelling about Athletes Village is that, like so many public spaces in Vancouver, there are all these overlapping jurisdictional issues, and they're extraordinarily complex places. It's often very difficult to discern the authorship of particular bits of the built environment. And it's also, I think, lost generally on viewers how different kinds of works are produced through the varying programs of the city's public art program. So it was an opportunity to talk about a work that was produced under the auspices of the Olympics with quite a sizable budget, and then also to look at the end of our walk where Athletes Village just suddenly skids to a stop and becomes its industrial past, like immediately. To look across Falls Creek and look at Jerry Pethick's Time Top, which was a piece that was commissioned through the city's private development program in 2006. And then also to look at the piece called A Falls Creek, which is under the Canby Street Bridge, a work by Trevor Mahovsky and Rhonda Wepler, which is a series of blue banded paint at the base of the pilings of the bridge that indicate the rise in sea level that's anticipated due to climate change. And that piece was completed under the auspices of artist-initiated projects, which I think is probably the most successful, has the most successful objects or outcomes of any of the programs, because artists can choose where in the city they would like to site the work. You know, if we think about public art in this city as a kind of a collection, it's associated with a period of time where development has been extraordinarily accelerated. So if we imagine 50 years from now, 100 years from now, if the city, if we imagined it as a museum, the collection around the core of the city and the new development around Falls Creek would be its primary collecting focus, if we think about it that way. With the artist-initiated program, that resulted in projects like Rhonda and Trevor's, but also Ken Lum's work, the East Van Cross, Digital Natives essentially was, although temporary, was under that same kind of framework. So we saw a lot more work on the east side of the city, on infrastructure, and in much more marginal or liminal kinds of spaces of the city. So for me, that was one thing that I thought it was important to reflect on, and that's all really very evident in that, you know, tiny, crazy, newly constructed neighborhood.
Yeah, maybe just to pick up a little bit on that. I think what's really interesting in terms of what I understand Duncan Lowe's presentation the other day in kind of mapping the decline of funding. Similarly, in the public art program, which is a major commissioning body in terms of art and public space in the city, they're really the main instigators of putting art in public space, although we try our best to provide an alternate voice. But what happened about, I guess, 3 or 4 years ago was the complete decimation of the civic public art program. And so before that, the civic program and the private development program were operating simultaneously. And the civic program tended to bring projects into the east side or other neighborhoods or older neighborhoods that weren't new developments, where the private development, of course, is new developments. The city decided that there was enough money coming in through the private development program that they didn't need to provide funds for the civic program. And so they basically stopped all funding for civic projects. So what that meant was that the only works that we would see in our public spaces were being commissioned by developers, basically, unless the VAG might put some pieces out or other sites might put some pieces out into public space. That was the dominant voice that we would see in our public spaces, which was, I think, a real issue. So when we started to think about what we wanted to talk about, we wanted to provide some kind of indication as to who the commissioning bodies were. And I think that's really important, because if we walk around a city and the only voice or the only agenda being addressed is marketing and branding and decoration, that is being kind of fueled by the main source of, you know, the main revenue stream, that's a real serious issue, I think, for us as citizens. So anyway, we wanted to touch on some of those issues as well.
Trying to think of anything that hasn't been covered. I think I'll just go with a metaphor then. I was remarking yesterday after the talk that those people from out of town might get the feeling that people from Vancouver are only about the waterfront, which is partially true. And it is certainly something that defines kind of how we interact with the world, and how our culturally what we emphasize is very much about the view and about the waterfront. And I was just thinking, as everyone was talking about the things that happen when at the confluence of different waterways. So, for instance, salt water and fresh water, you get something like brackish water, which is always creates this unique ecology. And I think False Creek in particular, if we were to take that metaphor into the city, is a place of brackishness. So there's an awful lot of things that happen there. And for me, standing in the athletes' village, it's kind of an incredible thing to consider all the things that meet in that spot. And from there, many of them are administrative or more civic or bureaucratic, and many of them are cultural and memory-based, and all those things are incredibly rich places for contemplation and for art. So, yeah.
Just maybe pick up on that briefly. For those of you that weren't able to attend the first walk, but thinking about these different meeting places and water, False Creek, in fact, is constructed to be False Creek, but also used to be marshland all the way out past where Science World is now, about 20 blocks, 30 blocks maybe, westward. So this whole giant expanse of land, what is now land, used to be marsh and water and salmon spawning streams. So again, thinking about this as a meeting place, a confluence of different streams, and what happens in that meeting place. And Vancouver itself as a meeting place of many different nations, First Nations, a site of later colonial contact and continued contact around the water and on the water as well. One of the things that happened with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that some of you might be aware of here in Canada on the Indian residential schools, when the meeting happened here, one of the most amazing things that took place was a meeting of nations, a meeting of First Nations from across British Columbia by canoe in False Creek. So everyone paddled, individual nations paddled into False Creek, and as historically happened, met. And had canoe protocol as well asserted about whose land this was, what the history was, and it was very. I've only seen it. I wasn't able to be there on the day, but I've seen video representations, and I think it's important to remember that this has always been a meeting place of nations, and it's a very contested. Vancouver's a very contested site as well as being occupied by many nations, by the Squamish, Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and other visiting nations from afar.
And maybe just on that note, I can stand in for Adrian up in the upper left-hand corner there of the screen. That was certainly a message she gave us in terms of curating her Amble, which emerged out of the pod plays from 2011, and then that continued after that. But she talked about wanting those walks to begin in one neighborhood and end in another. And obviously downtown here, where we have Gastown, Chinatown, Strathcona, the downtown east side, all abutting each other, and also being very contested. That I think that was something that was very pronounced in that walk as well. And we ended by walking from Crab Park to the gleaming ferry terminal, right, the Seabus terminal, but taking the back route, right? So the more working class, industrialized, seeing the backs of those gleaming towers that we see from the front, which is a really interesting thing that did. So I have one more big question for the panel, and then I thought we could open things up. There are probably questions from those of you who went on the walks, and then some from some who haven't as well. I have this question about the role of public art in Vancouver post-Olympics. So my question basically is for the panelists and the Art Amble curators, whether this public commissioning process through the Olympics specifically heightened an awareness of art in public spaces among Vancouver citizens, or whether the issue has more problematically become tied to accelerated development in the city post-Olympics. That is, there's a lot more of it because of buildings that require these kind of partnerships with public commissioning of public art. So I'm curious on the one hand whether the specific projects that maybe the focus on Athletes Village is appropriate here, the abundance of works in that, the concentration of works in an area brings attention to the role that public art can play in civic relational infrastructure of the city, or whether in fact this is just something that there's another narrative there, that this is actually the narrative that's driving this is development.
I think the proliferation of art in public spaces generally has the effect that, has a couple effects. I think people start to expect art in public places, which is a good thing. So they anticipate that, and maybe even get a little better at figuring out what's art or what might be art as more art is available within the city. The other thing I think that's good about it is that when there's a variety of art, it tends to break down that very initial knee-jerk reaction. Maybe that's what I'd like to talk about for just a few minutes. It's very curious what happens when you interrupt public space. People will not complain about advertising, about massive corporate presence in public space, of branding, extraordinarily huge signage. Because it seems like, I'm just sort of projecting, but I think maybe the reason why is that there's this notion that it's been paid for somehow, and that the authorship of it is like really clear, whether it's corporate or state kind of signage or messaging. But putting art in public spaces seems to be, to a certain part of the public, a huge affront. So in my neighborhood, which is Main and 15th, there was this piece that was commissioned by by TransLink, which is the transit authority, called, and it was, the commission went to a Montreal artist, Giselle Amantia, and she did a piece based on having kind of looked through a lot of the junk stores and antique stores on Main Street and found a figurine of a Russian poodle. And so she enlarged this poodle to this massive, I think it's like 16 feet or something, and it's up on a pole at 16th and Main, and then there was also some poodle-related stuff in the buses themselves. And people were absolutely outraged. When I went, like every store I went into, like, it's like, come on, like how upsetting could somebody really get about this poodle? But you go into the bank and you mention the poodle, and people went berserk. There was also, it was sort of like a call to arms at the City of Vancouver Public Art, that because of people phoning in talking about how irritated they were by this poodle. And I don't know whether it came to signify the gentrification of Main Street, that it was something about the hipsters and their poodles, et cetera, et cetera. But it became like a citywide thing of poodle discourse for a while there. And the really great thing that happened was that somebody opened a Twitter account called Main Street Poodle and started addressing the critique as if they were the poodle, which was fantastic. And so because I love the poodle, I started to engage on Twitter with the poodle, and it was, oh, you noble beast, every time I would walk past it to go to my studio, and the poodle would reply, got any sausages? And so this like huge, if you ever want to read something for fun on a Sunday morning, just check, just hashtag Main Street Poodle. So there's that kind of dialogue that has emerged out of this initial knee-jerk reaction, and I think that's what happens when there are larger amounts and diverse kinds of work in public space. So I think, yeah, it's good that there's more, but I also, based on what Barbara has had to say, the location where the concentration will remain, that's a big question mark for me. And while the city talks about being 1.8%, you say, and they sort of compare that to other cities, 1% for art. It's actually 1.8% of the buildable square footage of a site, which translates to 0.08% of a total construction budget. So, yeah, I think, and I guess the other thing, just before I pass it to the next person, would be that during the Olympics, I think there were a lot of projects like the Bright Light project that happened through this neighborhood and into Chinatown, did redefine for people the kinds of work that they might expect to see in public space, and promoted the notion of processions, of online work, various ways of thinking about the public, which I think is progressive.
Yeah, I think I just want to speak for a moment on the on one of the initiatives that's happening right now that many of you might be familiar with, the Vancouver Biennial. And what was interesting to me, so the Biennial is a large arts organization that cites public art across the city every 2 years. They have a 2-year development process, and then the citing of the works takes place over the next 2 years. And so for quite a number of years now, they've actually cited a large number of works across Vancouver. And they're doing so again at this point now. And so this as well can add to the discourse around public art, but I think, at least in this recent iteration, one of the things that happened is that they needed to address, and I think this was something the city imposed upon them, to address the communities at which the sites for these new public works would be placed. So they sent around a survey, and the survey, talked about where the locations of the works would be in the city. They had a Google Map, and they pinpointed all of the different places, many of them still around False Creek, but some of them outside of that, where the works would be. And the questions then were questions such as, and this is paraphrasing, not exact questions, but do you think a public work in this site would be good? Do you think a public work in this site would bring people to the park? Do you think a public work in this area would be useful? And so, I mean, it's striking to me, this is an opportunity to raise discourse. This is a massive public art consultation process, or it should be. It was put out to a wide variety of organizations and the Biennial Facebook page, except the problem is that it doesn't actually mention anything about the works. It doesn't mention anything about the relationship to site. It talks about public art in a very, very limited sense as being sort of a good or bad thing. Or in terms of promoting the usage of a park, but rather than talking about this opportunity to question public art's relationship to place, to expand how we think about public art, what the role of public art might be. So I see it as a major, a lost opportunity, to further this kind of discourse about what public art means in a city to the people that live in a place. And I think also speaks to the kind of work, unfortunately, that the Biennial promotes as sometimes aesthetically beautiful or interesting, but not having relationship to site whatsoever.
I'll just say one comment, but I would really love to hear from the people in the audience. Just one comment that once a project that I was working on, unfortunately, had to go to risk management. That's that you really don't want it ever to go to risk management. And basically what they said was, well, was this here before? And if it wasn't, then it represents a risk. Because it was, there. So, but I'd really love to hear from everybody. So, questions.
Vanessa, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I guess I want to pick up a little bit on what Dylan was saying about, I guess, artworks in relation to the spaces that they're in. And to me, the phrase which I wrote down when you said it was in relationship with denotes a kind of intimacy, and the thing that we're trying to achieve is a kind of intimacy. And I think something that happened during the Olympics was that opportunities for intimacy got smaller and smaller because we were expected as public artists or as artists to kind of bat higher than our weight in some ways. Like I think I mixed my sports metaphors there. Anyway, punch, bat, anyway. So we were supposed to be in competition with all the other things that were happening in public space. And as it turns out, many of those strategies ended up going very, very far towards this kind of spectacular, and that's wonderful. That's one part of what it is to be in public space, but I think it gave the illusion that that was what public art should do, and it's, in my view, not what public art should do. And I think what we're trying to work towards is a kind of is intimacy, and whatever that is in a site-specific sense. So we want to create certain kinds of connections, and those might not be possible within the downtown core in the same way that they're possible in a East Side park. So yeah, that's all I have to say.
I think this is a perfect opportunity to open it up to questions, and some of you went on the walks and might have some questions and comments. Others of you haven't, but are familiar with the city, I know, and might have some questions as well. Jeff?
Yeah, having attended the walk yesterday, which I thoroughly enjoyed, I was immediately struck in a couple of instances, particularly the sparrows, on what I thought was kind of unfortunate positioning of the statues in relation to particularly those spine lamp structures. And then again with the maple leaf, the Aboriginal piece, the maple leaf, how it was recessed into the bushes and was apparently going to get overgrown eventually unless they raised it or brought it forward or something. I'm just curious about, can somebody outline what the process is for decisions around the site and the positioning in the various, like with the city initiated program, maybe the biennial and the developer, particularly the developer, like who makes the curatorial choices and those details, if that's not too detailed for you to...
That is a Barbara.
Well, it has evolved, but where it is right now, so this is Barbara from Cole Projects putting her public art consulting hat on here. So now when I'm working with a developer and an artist comes up with a concept proposal, now it has to actually go to urban planning, that proposal, just to check its location, the proposed location, supposedly to ensure that it's not in a fire lane or any of those kinds of things. They're not supposed to be commenting at all about content or concept. So in part, it's urban planning having a role in determining where it can be placed. So that's one issue, is location and placement. I don't know that there was a lot of discussion at the Olympic Village. Everything was going at such a rapid rate. There was very little community consultation. The city has a certain kind of community consultation, kind of a program, I suppose, that wasn't in place for the Olympic Village. So the urban planners really had a lot more influence that had less opportunity for objection, I suppose, than any other development. So the birds came in last, in a sense. Those ribs, those design elements were in place, and then Mafanwi basically had to deal with it, more or less. So I hope that answers your question. I'm only dealing with location. Towards the end of your question, you also asked about curation, which is a whole other can of worms. But
particularly with developers, is it any different with when a developer is obliged to provide public art? Does it go through a similar?
Yes.
The same thing? Okay.
Yeah. There's all these little checks and balances along the way that the city becomes very involved in. The city is like regulates every aspect in a certain way. Although they do allow for the actual selection of the work to go to a peer panel. So, and they respect that jury process. Once the jury makes a recommendation that the work go forward, it's very, very, very seldom contested by the city officials. From that point on, it's usually about technical issues.
Other questions? Karen?
Okay, so thinking about the Main Street Poodle, who has tweeted back woof woof to me on several occasions, and thinking about the level of distrust around this poodle, or at least the anger that he provokes along Main Street. I was thinking about that in relation to the Olympic Village as this highly spectacularized plaza, and maybe because Vancouver and London have been on our comparative brains this week, then of course thinking about Trafalgar Square and the plinths and the ways in which that is a square that has a similar horizon of expectations as perhaps the Olympic Plaza, in which you go there with the expectation that you will see something big, something out of the ordinary, something, okay, what's on that fourth plinth now? What is performing now in the public realm? And so is it, in part, that certain spaces are sanctioned for a particular type of spectacularness in public, whereas seeing it on this kind of more, semi-residential path provokes something?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting, your question from a couple perspectives. One of which is that we don't really have any squares
Exactly.
in Vancouver, and there's been initiatives to somehow address that with every major kind of like civic development. And the public gathering places that we do have established historically, say the steps. So, like, rather than a square, we've densified the back of the Vancouver Art Gallery as the site of protest on the stairs going up to sort of a false entrance on the back. And so what we expect, I guess, to see on the stairs at the VAG are these, sort of eruptions of dissent or resistance. What we expect to see, I think, in Athletes Village is this, in a kind of way, what we do see, and that's a very manufactured surface and a very regulated kind of space, and then also, to a certain extent, that's a very recent thing. I think, to hang around down there a year ago would have been, there was nothing, and there were no cafes, and there was no drugstore, and there was no liquor store, and there was none of that stuff. So it was like very much like a walk through the way that East London was described in relation to the London Olympics.
I just wanted to pick up in relation to that question, but also on what Vanessa was saying about an intimacy of public works. And I think, when we think about public art, we think about the broadest possible public. Or that's maybe sometimes how the city considers what a public art should be, in a sense, for the public, the biggest public possible. It should reach the most amount of people as possible. But I'm really interested in works that are for very particular communities. And I think, thinking about Indigenous public work, what about reserve public art? What about public art that's for an Indigenous community, that's for maybe the urban Aboriginal community in the downtown East Side, that speaks to them first, that might not be for the broadest possible public, but be in relationship with a very particular public. And maybe we could say this about a lot of works that are, I might be thinking to too much in one way about this idea for the broadest possible public. But I'm really interested in which we might be able to, the ways in which we might be able to generate different forms of intimacy with different particular publics.
In some ways this goes back to your initial question. I think one of the things that happened during the Olympics was that there were works of different durations, which was really positive, and there was also money to actually talk about those works. So if we think about it as kind of a museum model of actually refreshing a collection or contextualizing a collection, that there was actually little videos, interviews with the artists, really widespread. They appeared, on airlines as part of the package, the audiovisual package. There were brochures, there was websites, all of that, which is what the city, in many respects, I feel, have really just don't ever do. So they have a collection, but they never talk about the collection. They have a registry that is like a database that says, this is the work, here's where it is, here's the artist, blah, blah, blah. But that they don't ever really make attempts to, like a museum would, refresh the work, put another work beside it temporarily and recontextualize that work, present a new understanding of how that work has evolved over time and what it now means 10 years later to be in this place. So I think that's another really kind of a major issue, and that works of duration, intimate works, could actually start to reach a broader audience, not necessarily as a spectacle, but rather as a mode of understanding, if there was more education.
Yeah, for me the question is also about the kind of vocabulary that we're creating for the public around art. So there's the very spectacular pieces, which I think are amazing and wonderful and have a place and really enrich our urban spaces. But then there's the direct other side, which is very extremely community-based, very much embedded. They're very much about collaborations with community, and between those two things, there's a huge swath of practice. And I think generally at the funding level, there's not a great deal of opportunity for those works that fall in the middle of those two things. So there's the way in which art is for the public good on one side, or art is for the sort of like the public aesthetics, and those two things are, it's an illusion to think that that's the way practices go. So for me, it's kind of like, how are we supporting that middle ground? And I think in some ways, cities or public art or developers often look to art as kind of ambassadors of engagement, and their vocabulary is sometimes limited in terms of what those practices can do. So I guess I'm very interested in ways that we can generate within funding bodies more of a nuanced understanding of what engagement could be, and I'm not really clear on how we do that yet, but that's certainly for me the task.
I just want to also encourage our London guests to bring that context into this conversation as well, as I think Karen has started to do. And for me, I'm reminded here of, I forget the artist's name, but the most controversial, or one of the most controversial pieces on the plinth was by the disabled artist. Yeah, which Jenny literally brought into her opening ceremony. And also, it has traveled to Venice, am I not mistaken? Kirsty, do you want to talk with? Yeah.
I mean, Alison Lapper absolutely divided London. For some of us, it was like the most fantastic, iconic thing. She represented femininity, motherhood, disability, a warrior. She was everything. And some people were repulsed by her and complained and said, something like that should not be in public display. It was deeply shocking. So certainly when Bradley and I came around to doing the Paras, it was like a no-brainer that we had to have Lapper as part of our, we went from the Big Bang Theory right bang into the middle of London, and Lapper was our icon really for disabled people. And Mark Quinn, he was a very scary person to meet. He rocks up at his studio with his Bentley and said, "Oh, God, I suppose I've got to park my car myself. My sister's not here." I'm going, "Oh my God, who is this man?" So he just outlined the narrative and said, look, we haven't got plan B. We need the blueprint of Lapa. He went, why don't you have the real thing? I said, it's too wee. We want a 20-foot inflatable. The fourth plinth is fantastic. I think it's one of the most successful thing that we have in London because it constantly entices curiosity. And when we had it was Anthony Gormley did the fourth plinth, and there was 100 days, 100 different artists, including disabled artists, craned up somehow in their wheelchair up onto the top, making very big political protests. And it was one of those moments when I felt very, very proud of London. You know, because sometimes it can be seen as a passive, just getting on with the city, but sometimes we're out there. It was a real artistic domain for everybody. Jen, do you want to say anything about public art? You live in London as well. Sorry, my brain's just gone to mush. Who else is from London? You are?
Well, I guess I'm just echoing a lot of what you've already said on the panel, but I think that ephemeral or temporary works in a situation allow you to take much more risk, be experimental, be provocative. The fourth plinth is a perfect example of that. And the problem when you start installing permanent works is the kind of loopholes artists are expected to jump through, which prevents really an opportunity to do anything which in many cases is challenging. And I think that's, my background is as a sculptor, but I steered away from making that kind of work because of the kind of compromises that I think often artists are pushed through. And I guess you've reflected that already on your panel. This is a comment more than anything else, but I wanted to just thank you all for the 3 walks, because I thought, for someone who's not been to Vancouver before, and such a short visit, it was a really wonderful insight into the city and into the fabric of the city. And I think, the false island in False Creek is something I'll take away with me. And the notion also actually of third nature, which I thought was a really interesting idea and concept. So it's...
Yeah, thank you. First of all, to echo what Neville just said, it was an extraordinary opportunity, and thank you very much for your generosity in showing us Vancouver in that way. And I think also thank you to the organisers again for insisting that in those ways we would walk the site of the city, or one of the cities we were discussing this weekend. So I think that that's a really important moment. And I can't resist a comment on the plinth, which seems to me to be a particularly overdetermined site, but a particularly important resistant site because it is in the shadow of the National Gallery, right? And I think that that's an important part of how we read what's on the plinth there. The question I wanted to ask you was that Calgary also has a 1% on projects for public art, and it seems to me that projects that are City of Calgary or quasi-City of Calgary projects tend to be just what Vanessa was describing there, artists from Calgary engaging the communities where the art is going to be positioned and thinking about, again, the site and the people and the historical and contemporary uses of that. But then at the other end of that, if you have 1% of the tallest office block west of Toronto designed by Norman Foster, you end up with a shitload of money that you have to spend with a big international artist. And so in front of the Bow Tower is one of those lattice work metal heads of Jaume Plensa. This one's called Wonderland, which is a beautiful piece of work. It works very well with that building, but it requires 24/7 private security so that nobody climbs up on it in a drunken moment and all of those kinds of things. But the question I really wanted to ask you was, how is it true in Vancouver too that there is this kind of friction between the imported big national or international artist and public art that really is about Vancouver and Vancouver's made work? Go ahead.
I would say that in Vancouver, there is a real acceptance of art from all over the world. In some ways, I like to think that the Western Front had a lot to do with that, as an artist-run center that is now 40 years old, that in the early years brought artists from away, most often performative works, some music works. And I think it really kind of set the tone for a real acknowledgement of learning on a global level. So I personally feel that there's great acceptance of art from away, especially within the art community. I mean, I think that in part, just the Push Festival, Norman's here, bringing art from around the world of all kinds is a huge event here. I mean, people come for that purpose, for that reason. The only time that I really hear it is when the media tries to get a hold of it and massages it in a really kind of shallow, stupid way. But otherwise, I think there's huge acceptance.
I think it also benefits from the fact that there are quite a number of Vancouver artists that have international reputations. So the Stan Douglas piece outside and the new Rodney Graham piece that will be associated with that crazy big building, Vancouver House. But I think also, I just to actually mention initiatives that Barbara has been involved in that I think are really innovative and challenging. One in particular was the public art requirement by a college called Langara College here in Vancouver. And she, through working with them on the art plan, really tried to devise an art plan that had a strong relationship to their values and mission. So actually got permission of the city to not have a permanent artwork associated with their new build of a new library. And instead, she proposed a series of residencies that were educational. So aligning with the educational mission of the organization, created a two-year program that then I proposed to run it, and we went in and did this for offered 3 artist residencies. So that as an innovative alternative to spending that 1.8%, I think is a really interesting way to think about those larger budgets and the kinds of impact that, talking about intimacy, talking about legacy. And so you're more likely to see that, of course, within, in relationship to a public institution, but maybe not necessarily. A lot of the new developments, their footprints are so small that there's no place to put the art unless it's clad on the exterior or buried under the building, I don't know, on the roof. So perhaps with this sort of proliferation of art, that there's an opportunity to be more open to, hopefully not in a marketing sense, find some common ground between what's important in contemporary art practice right now and the developers' willingness to see that.
Kirsty, did you have a comment that you wanted to make?
No, well, I had just been thinking of Susan's talk earlier. I had been thinking of Susan's talk earlier today about the legacy, in some ways, of Calgary being upscaling, and to think of mega events beyond just the one city, to Thunder Bay, for example. And so I wondered about some of the things that we saw on our walk, if they too have had reach beyond Vancouver. So when we mentioned Alison Lapper here, for example, you're saying maybe that has toured to Venice so whether that's true or not, can we find out if it's true about some of the things we saw here on our walks, or do you know of any impacts they may have had, or dialogue or things like the poodle talking back elsewhere? I don't know.
global network of poodles.
I think the Koberling-Kaltwasser, the bulldozer project, Koberling and Kaltwasser are Berlin-based artists who have a history and a reputation for using the leftovers from mega events. So taking materials from these things, whether they're billboards or wood or whatever it might be, and building art out of it that is in some ways a critique of the mega event. And so I guess this is a bit of a stretch, but I think that the work that they did through other sites, the Wheatboard bulldozer, is part of a global career or a global exhibition kind of strategy of theirs. So it's one of a collection of works that they've done as part of that concept. And another project that, if I can be so bold, that I would invite you to. We currently have a project that's on a barge and is to be towed by tug to different locations. And right now it's moored at the Vancouver Maritime Museum in the harbor there. And you're welcome to come on board and explore it. It's quite a remarkable piece that really in many ways reflects upon our coastal communities up and down the BC coast. So it extends beyond the specifics of Vancouver and the city and urbanity and moves into other kinds of, it even touches upon utopian communes and social constructs and the big idea and failed utopians and things like that. That's up and down our coast. So I'll be there this afternoon from 3 to 5 and also tomorrow from 3 to 5, and you can take a little False Creek ferry that will drop you off. So these cards have some of the information about the project, so you're welcome to come to that. Anybody else?
I'm just calling up some stuff on the web for you, Barbara, around Deadhead.
Oh, terrific.
Is Deadhead only until the end of this weekend, or can we?
Yep. We tend to have we put out an open flag. When you see the flag, you can come aboard. On weekends, Friday, Saturday, Sundays. Our next big public event will be August 24th. It's a big open house, and the ferries are free all day that day. And that evening, there will be a pretty wild hour-long percussion event with First Nations drumming and others. Up to about 30, as I understand it, 30 different drummers aboard. So that's our grand finale, because we'll be leaving shortly after that and heading out to different places beyond.
Other questions, comments? Lunch is still being brought in, so I'm kind of trying to... but actually, if I could ask one final thing. Rosalind Deutsch, in her book Evictions, Art and Spatial Politics, makes this comment about public art needing to be interventionist, not integrationist. And Tilted Arc is one of her, and the removal of Tilted Arc is one of her main comments. So it's precisely to do the thing that the poodle thing does, right? To promote dissensus around the work. More recently, and more from a performance studies rather than visual art perspective, Shannon Jackson has made an argument in her book Social Works about social coordination. She's interested in actually precisely the things that you have talked about, Barbara, in terms of the labor and the collaborations that go into producing the work, and that's the narrative we need to hear more about. That's just I'm just sort of throwing that out there. But it seems to me, I guess I'm interested in this idea about how public art, from its conception to its installation, actually tells a narrative about this, is another layer in the narrative of civic infrastructure and the relational infrastructure of a city, and whether that's an important part of the story to tell. And how do we get that out there other than people just going and seeing the built, installed piece? I don't know if anybody wants to comment.
Oh, did you have something to say?
No, I was just
I should not have picked up the mic so soon. Okay. I am really interested in the idea of relationships, and not simply in the sense of relational work or in site-specific or social practice. I'm interested in the role of the artist or the curator as a kind of negotiator, and to me that's been the richest thing that's fed into my practice, is that what we are doing is creating conversations and becoming skilled at communication. And so for me, if we're part of the intimacy is about the act of bringing these things into being, so massaging these things into being. So the work that Barbara does, for instance, is a kind of like is a deeply relational role. It is a kind of proliferation of the ethics of communication, I think, that we want to have. So I think that's, for me, that's very much part of how we create work in public space, and that's, I think, why public art or public practices have been so have returned in my own life, because it provides kind of a template for good living in some ways. And it's disappointing, just as life is sometimes, but it's also kind of promotes optimism, hopefully.
Yeah, I wanted to just respond by describing a project that we began last summer and that will kind of carry on over the next few years. And it's called, it was sort of this general umbrella frame called Space Audit, where we kind of set out and audit spaces in this, very much from that perspective of what are the overlapping constituencies, what are the frictions, and where's the grease, basically. So last summer we did, we've been doing a lot of research about artists as urbanists, and so we did a project at Kingsgate Mall in Mount Pleasant, which is like a really low-rent mall, but provides very, really crucial services like a liquor store and a post office and, your basic dollar store and a cheap grocery store. And it's sited right across from a new development, which will be, I believe, 21 stories high, which will just look like a big raised finger in the middle of the neighborhood. Really, seriously, it's just going to be appalling. So we were, anxious about this new development, but wanted to think about getting ahead of the, kind of knee-jerk debates about development in Vancouver. So we set up an open studio outside the liquor store at Kingsgate Mall, and when people came, we did it for a week last summer, and when people came out of the liquor store, we didn't really run up and try and consult with them, or the way that, say, a city consultation process would try and engage them. We just worked, we had an open studio, and we were just working on stuff, and we had some signage, and people would come up, and we would ask them, well, what do you want? And so this project was called I Know What I Want, and if they told us what they wanted, we'd give them a button that says I know what I want. And we bought a bunch of materials from the dollar store, and when they told us what they wanted, we made it in model form for them. So over the course of the week, with this just basic template of the intersection, we made all of these models of these crazy things, from like another library to a pony ranch to a vertical community garden to, there's kind of a jazz bar, a good jazz bar. And this model combined and recombined over and over again over the course of the week. Now, this fall, we're heading into the next phase where we'll be working on a fake development proposal for that same location. So we're going to step into the role of being the developer and propose a model based on what people want. So our idea was to think about public space in terms of where the friction is and how to introduce friction into a system where it's a pretty smooth glide between the developers and the city's planning department. So introducing friction and looking at the generative potential of friction in the same way that we're talking, about the poodle, right? That it's a more complex, richer kind of conversation.
Just briefly, I wanted to say, I think part of that friction in terms of the work that I'm looking at and hoping to facilitate as well is to think about the history of place before the city. The fact that everything here is part of the place we now call Vancouver, but has a long indigenous history since time immemorial. Many nations would say. And so I think that needs to be layered in to every process, maybe I would say, to think about the city as not just something that sprang up out of nowhere and thinking about works that relate to that, but going back and having difficult consultations, I think, with all of the nations that have claims to this place, that have lived in this place and been here for a very long time before Vancouver became Vancouver.
I'll make a call for any final comments or questions because food is arriving.
I'll just say as one last comment, something that maybe I find really interesting as a performance studies person are the ways in which you're using these very sometimes theatrical tactics to engage the public. And also what is interesting for me is that there's this kind of trend in a lot of theater and performance now around performances of intimacy, but that aren't often thought about in terms of a politics of intimacy, which I think is what, Vanessa, you're trying to promote in terms of the kind of intimate relations that you're trying to foster through artwork. So it's just kind of interesting to see it from another disciplinary lens. Thank you.
So I just I'm going to try, with Barbara's help, to find the time-lapse YouTube clip that we couldn't see, and I'll show that. But we've been sitting for a while, so I want to invite people to have some lunch. And just let people know that you've got a long break because we're not coming back until 2:30 for our concluding summary remarks session. And Karen and Kirsty and I had a proposal, I don't think it's raining outside, that to walk off your lunch, you might want to take your own self-guided amble through this part of the city, and maybe with somebody you haven't yet connected with at the conference, and have a little bit of dialogue about some of the issues we've been talking about, and then that can come back and animate some of our discussion, which we don't want to lead per se, but rather want to have a conversation. And we'll probably return to some of those opening questions that Karen led us off with in her opening remarks as a way to animate that discussion. So that's our proposal. You obviously don't have to do that, but we are encouraging you to maybe do that. Now I invite you to have some lunch. Thank you very much. And please join me in thanking our panelists.